This video is going to cover the topic of line plots. Be sure the date and topic are at the top of your page. The essential question for this video is how do we make and read line plots? And just as a heads up, line plots are also sometimes referred to as dot plots, so you'll hear me use both names. So line plots are used for statistical and numerical data. And I just want to take a moment to talk about that term, numerical. We'll contrast that with something called categorical data. Statistical or numerical data comes from answers to questions that can be answered with a variety of numbers, versus categorical data, which has questions that have answers that can kind of be separated into groups or categories. I'll give you an example of both. If I ask someone how many pets they have, they're going to answer with one of a variety of numbers. Maybe they have 0, maybe they have 11, maybe they have 3, right? That can be answered with a variety of numbers. On the other hand, if I ask you what your favorite ice cream flavor is, you might say mint chocolate chip or swirl or cookie dough, and that would be placed into a group or category when I'm going through all of the survey results. When we are using numerical data or collecting statistics, one thing we can do is that we can display it on a dot plot or a line plot, right? Line plots are a way to display statistical data. And we'll display it on a number line. So let's imagine for a moment I did ask folks how many pets they had, and this table here shows our results. Looking over the information, I'm going to take a moment to see what my smallest answer is. Looks like that's my smallest answer. And I'm going to look for my largest answer, right? So my numbers range between 0 and 6. With that information, we're going to make a number line that goes from 0 to 6. Notice with my number line that I was consistent when I put the numbers down here. So I decided to count by ones. I didn't skip count. And I was trying to be mindful to keep the spacing consistent here. From there, I'm actually just going to mark the responses that I got. And I'm going to just change my color here just because I can. So I see that there are 2 people who said they had 0 pets. So I'm just going to use the letter X and I'm going to mark that's one of the responses of 0 and that's the other. I see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who said they had 1 pet. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 2 people who had 2 pets. Someone had 3, someone had 4, no one had 5, so I'm going to leave that blank, but someone had 6, right? So I'm just transferring over the data onto my number line. And each X represents each response. I also want to make sure that if somebody was just looking at my line plot, they would know what I was displaying. So I'm including here a title. You can see right here that I want to have a title. And I also, and I also want to make sure that I include a label as well. All right, so here's another line plot that I've actually already created. Take a moment, pause the video so that you can recreate this line plot in your own notebook. Notice that this one has the title Student Study Time and a label that tells us that each one of those numbers along the bottom on our number line is a number of hours spent studying, right? So even though you don't know anything else, just by looking at this graph, you know what this represents. Also notice that this time the number line doesn't count by ones, and I didn't start at 0, and that is okay, right? I decided to count consistently by quarter fractions this time. They're evenly spaced, it increases by a quarter each time, totally allowed. So just make a little note of that so that you, when you're making your line plots, know that you have a little freedom in choosing how to set up your number line, as long as it's consistent and spaced evenly. Looking at this line plot, even though you don't know who I asked and I don't have a table of information, there's some things that we can gather, right? Some information we can get. So there are 4 questions here. What was the smallest amount of time anybody spent studying? What was the longest amount of time? How many students answered the survey? And what time was answered the most often? You should be able to answer those just by looking at the graph. So take a moment to answer those questions and then unpause and we'll see how you did. How'd you do? I saw that the lowest number on our number line was 1 hour and the largest or highest answer was 3 hours. By counting the number of X's I saw on the line plot, I was able to determine that there were 21 students who gave a response, and the highest number was right here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 5 students who said 2 hours, and that was the highest response of any time in the survey. So we can get a lot of information just by looking at this line plot. One way that we use line plots is that we actually use the shape of the line plot to get an overview of information and to describe what's going on with the data. So we're going to draw a few sketches of some line plots and talk about the names of the shapes that they represent. These are very generic, so I just called them all title and label, but take a moment, this shouldn't take a long time. Go ahead and just re-sketch these on your page, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the shape of each of these. And as you're doing this, you might notice that I counted by tens. I used a consistent scale counting by tens. I didn't start at 0, but that's okay. I was consistent as I went. So the first one we have here, when you look at this data, it's all pretty flat, right? It's not a perfectly flat line. It does go down a little bit, but it's pretty flat. And so we call this type of data where all of the numbers have about the same amount of information. We call this uniform. And that kind of makes intuitive sense, right? When something's all pretty similar, if we wear a uniform for work or for school, it means things are all kind of the same. This second graph is a little bit trickier, right? So we have sort of this curve that seems to go down from the right-hand side down to the left-hand side, kind of peaks on the right and goes down towards the left. We call that skewed left. This data is sort of skewed, and we call it skewed left because it goes down to the left, which means you might be thinking that you can predict then what number 3 might look like, right? If it starts high and sort of skews down towards the right. So if you guessed that we call that skewed right, you would be correct. And this last one I've labeled as symmetrical, right? It's not a perfectly symmetrical line, but it kind of goes up and back down, and the peak is right there in the middle. So we would refer to that as symmetrical. There's a lot more vocabulary that comes with line plots and dot plots, but that should be a good place for us to get started. All right, so there's a lot more to cover, but I want to leave you with a chance for you to just try making your own dot plot or line plot. So I have some data here, the number of laps students ran in PE, we can call it. So I want you to take this and just simply put it onto a nice consistent number line and mark off all of the information, include a title and a label and all the things you need. And we'll be sure that we practice this more in class. And remember, the essential question was, how do we make and read line plots? So hopefully we have a little bit more information on that than we did before we started.